Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm really grateful to Professor Murray, especially Ray and Chong, for getting the money to get me here. You know, the gasoline from Claremont is expensive. But I'm really happy to be here because I have a special feeling in my heart for the Cal State system. I would never be where I'm standing here today and have become an Indiana Jones if I had not taken Chinese second year at Cal State LA. I was a student at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, and I rode my motorcycle 3 days a week down the Arroyo Seco, little Honda 360, because it was the only place around that A, offered second year Chinese, and B, would accept me, and C, I could afford, already in a graduate program. And it was because of that program, and there were about this many students in the program, all Chinese, except for me and 2 other white guys. And I went to the professor, I said, all these Chinese, they all speak Chinese, they all write it, what's going on? He says, well, don't worry, I'm going to make them write essays, and they're going to work hard, but the only way we could offer this class is to have this many students. So you're lucky to be here. And actually, some of those students became my best friends for life. So it turned out to be a great situation. And now that I'm working at Pomona College, I just have never had a chance to come out here and see your campus. It's a beautiful campus. And you're really very fortunate to be here. And you're fortunate to have these outstanding professors and staff members who are very dedicated to you. And I'm just really happy to share with you some of my experience of doing research in China and Central Asia. It is a little bit like Indiana Jones. It's not the years, it's the mileage plus on United. Don't look like it, but I feel like George Clooney sometimes. I just hit 2.5 million miles on United. So basically, this is an area of Western China that the locals tend to refer to, the people known as the Uyghur, as Eastern Kurdistan. You may have heard of the region of Xinjiang or Urumqi. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I spent time researching that area, and also China's Middle East pivot. Because you may have heard that President Obama has had an Asia pivot. He's sort of mired down with a few other things right now, both Middle East and Obamacare. But he definitely has a focus on Asia, and he's trying to reorient U.S. policy somewhat away from the Middle East. He would like to. He can't quite get out of it very easily, get disentangled as fast enough to move towards Asia. But China is much better on the court, on this court, than President Obama, as good as he is on the basketball court. They've far outplayed the U.S. They've far outplayed him in their Middle East pivot. They've been doing it longer, and they're a lot more successful at it. And I think, hopefully, in this lecture, we can take a few lessons from the Chinese on their very successful Middle East policy. Basically, all these new nations of Central Asia, which are all basically new since 1992, when the Soviet Union fell apart, and all of these countries you see on the map, including Iran, including Eastern Europe, including Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, including Israel and the Palestinian Authority, they're all friends of China, including Iran. Unlike us, how popular are we out there? So the Chinese have done something right, and I think we should learn from them. And then also, often Western scholars like myself are saying Chinese should listen to our ideas and look at the policies, but I think on this subject particularly, we have a lot to learn from them. And they didn't start it recently. They started it in the 15th century with a man named Zheng He, who went from China, actually was a Muslim in the high ranking of the Chinese government. He was the highest ranking admiral, and he was a Muslim in the 15th century, way back there, before Columbus. So we're going to talk about that a little bit at the very end, if I can talk fast enough. But what's bringing China together and into the Middle East much more than ever before is this issue. What got me interested in this region is this issue, because I very early got interested in ethnic minorities in Western China who happen to be Muslims. So that kind of brought me into the issue of energy because of the Middle East and the Middle Easterners who had come to China as migrants in the Middle East. So we talked about this region, all these stands with the longest names, like Kyrgyzstan. I was actually offered to be a president of a college in Kyrgyzstan run by George Soros. And they asked me what I could bring to them, and I said vowels. Because this region has very few vowels, right? Very hard to pronounce, very difficult languages. And I tried to learn a few of them, not very well. But basically try to tie this together with what some scholars are calling China's Xinjiang problem. Maybe a new word for you, and And by the end of this lecture, I think you'll know something about that region, I hope. So where is this area? If you look at Eurasia, the whole continent, you can see it's basically in the heart of Eurasia. But for China, it's the far west. And indeed, the name of this region in Chinese means new territory or new region. The locals, the Uyghurs, refer to this area as Eastern Turkestan. And that's an older name that does exist on maps and places. But for China, it's a fairly recent, firm acquisition. There have been Chinese in this area. There have been contacts going way back to the Han Dynasty or our world. So there have been Chinese troops, Chinese colonies, Chinese peoples in this area going way back. Why? Because of the Silk Roads. And they brought Chinese there, and they brought Westerners into China. Now let me just mention a recent research project that I was engaged in this region. Again, here's these people without vowels. I was looking at across borders because a lot of these people have their own countries now, but they also have large populations in China. And as an anthropologist, I had focused on the Uyghur, because they're the majority people of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. But there are also other groups that cross the borders, that have countries attached to Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. The Uyghurs don't have a country. They have the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Now, some Uyghurs would love to have a Uyghuristan, or an Eastern Turkestan. Chinese don't like that idea very much. And I'm going to tell you why. So this was a project that I was engaged in. This is actually the entrance to Afghanistan. Some of you probably didn't know that China shares a very small border, known as the Wakhan Corridor, with Afghanistan. Notice the date. What happened 12 days later? 9/11. That completely changed the face of this region. U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden decided it was a nice place for him to hang out. Bora Bora is not far down this corridor. No roads there. But the Chinese were very, very worried that if things went wrong, as they have in Afghanistan, it went wrong for the Russians, it went wrong for the British, and they've gone wrong for us. We should have learned from them. Maybe their refugees would come flooding into this region. So China quickly sealed its borders, kicked foreigners like me out, and got very worried about a similar terrorist attack that could happen in China that happened to the United States. And so they began cooperating with us on anti-terrorism. They were scared to death, but legitimately so, of jihadi-style radical Islam spilling into China. Not so much across this border, but more from across Pakistan, where they've been having problems in Kashmir and parts of India. So there I was doing research with a lot of students about your age, some of them college students, some of them graduate students, who were locals. And we had this big grant, and we were funding them to go back to their homes and their villages and look at the Tajik. These are Tajik men. Kazakh woman was running the program, and there's a Kyrgyz student. And I was still living in Hawaii, so I had my aloha shirt on. We began to look at how these groups cross a border. We had various sites, about 3,000 households. We were doing interviews with these students. And I fell in love with a group of Kazakhs who were still very nomadic people. Maybe if I come back and talk about my Kazakh research. And if you're interested in this research, you can go to the web and you can find out. It's called the, you can go and check it. It's funded by the ACLS. And there are some coordinated projects. And we linked up to other projects with people working literally around the world. But with 9/11, suddenly this project was stopped. And I couldn't go back. I have not been back to this region really since early 2003 to 2004. I was way up on the border of Mongolia, riding horses, alpine, pristine, just me and a bunch of Kazakhs and one Chinese cadre who had to ride behind me on the horse, for 13 hours. You can go online and actually on Google Video and see an hour-long video. It's not on YouTube for some reason, I don't know why. And find this video that I made. Because I always like to sort of tell students about living in these yurts, these tents, and there was no instructions on how to set one up. I actually bought one while I was there. I was trying to figure out how I would set it up when I got it back. It's still there. I haven't gotten it out. So we made this video to sort of remind us how to do it. They set these tents up within about 4 to 6 hours, and then they can take them down too. So that was in this area, right on the border of Mongolia, kind of near Russia. Notice all the countries around this area, and that's part of China's Xinjiang problem. The Xinjiang problem is, probably you have all heard about China's Tibet problem, or about Tibet. And if I pointed on a map, or asked you to point on a map where Tibet is, you could probably, all of you, kind of give me an idea where it is, even if you don't specialize in that. And you probably have heard of the Dalai Lama, right? And you probably know something about Tibetans. Well, most people, until about 10 years ago, had really never heard of this region. Not only could they not pronounce it, that funny X in Chinese pinyin, but also it really didn't come on our horizon for the United States and Westerners. And even Chinese, very few Chinese had actually visited this area. So when China, I started writing about Xinjiang problem, people go, what? Who? The Uyghurs? Huh? Who are they? Now, however, I think that's changed quite a bit. Part of the reasons it's changed is my colleagues and I, in fact, there was a tour group with the Asia Society who took a group out there. They asked me to go with them as a lecturer. And there's no English book about this region that they could take with them and read about. And you didn't have Wi-Fi back then in the 90s, so they couldn't just go on Wikipedia. So they wanted to have travel books, and there's nothing. So we scholars got together, and they found what they thought were the best scholars writing in English on this subject, got us all together, paid us pretty well, pretty unusual. Later we were accused of using CIA money, but it was actually all loose donations. But I'll tell you the larger story, back story is later, because there was a wild card. There was a CIA guy in the group that we didn't know about. So the Chinese did find out about it. We wrote this book about the Xinjiang problem and issues, and what did we do? We said, it's Chinese policies. There's a lot of issues, but we dared to criticize China's policies. Now, Western scholars, like I said, scholars do this all the time. We're always say, Chinese, or pollution is a problem, their Chinese currency is too high, all that. But, so it's not unusual for Western scholars to do this. What was unusual was this. This is the stamp that you really don't want to see in your passport. And notice it's nowhere near visas or other pages. It basically means you're not welcome in China. And so all of the scholars that collaborated in that book, about 16 of us, if you can Google the Xinjiang 13, find out as well, were banned in Beijing. And needless to say, I have not been back to Western China since that took place. And here it's 2006, but it's actually started up in about 2003 and 2004. It took us a while to figure out that we were all in the same boat. And I said, wow, we weren't that critical of China. We weren't that. We actually praised a lot of China's policy, and we think they're actually doing some really great things. We certainly didn't support an independence Xinjiang, like an independent Tibet, like some scholars write about free Tibet. We didn't support that, like the Dalai Lama. We didn't argue for an independent region. Certainly didn't support radical Islam. Certainly didn't support terrorism and violence. We were critical of those. And yet, we... Now, I'm one of the few of the group of 16 scholars, and it's very unusual. I mean, people get denied visas all the time. Perhaps you've been denied visas, but it's very unusual for a group like this. And in fact, I've actually never heard of it before. And the U.S. denies visas all the time. So what was going on? Well, it was a blacklist that was conveniently ignored by our college presidents and university presidents. Why? Because everybody wants to do business in China. Everybody wants to have exchange. Everybody wants to do research. Not only is China rich, but Chinese students want to come here. And they want to pay out-state tuition, right? And help our universities. And they want to study here. But as Peter Perdue, a professor at MIT and now Yale University historian, argued, said, they would tell us we should know why we got denied. Go to the visa limit, you should know why. Well, we didn't know why. We were a pretty middle-of-the-road academic work. If you go and you read about this, Carol Weimer, an economist who now consults at UCLA, but she actually gave up a 10-year job at the University of Hawaii, so you know what that's all about. To go to UCLA, she was doing so well in consulting with the ADB that she didn't think she needed to be a professor anymore. She was going to China all the time. Whoop! She wrote a chapter on the Chinese economy in Xinjiang. She couldn't go back to China. Lost her job over it, was cut off from her daughter, who was with her ex-husband living in Beijing, couldn't visit her daughter. So it was tragic for some people. For me, I was old and gray and, read a few books. And I could kind of coast for a while. But the junior scholars were really, really affected. A couple of people may not have gotten tenure over this. She was out of work. And there was a radiation effect, not just among our work, but among other students and other people who wanted to study this region. Suddenly, like, we were like, HIV positive or something. People would have wives and they're, come on, what did you guys do wrong? And the Chinese have a phrase for this. Sha Ji Jing Ho, kill a chicken to make the monkeys afraid. So chicken makes a lot of noise, and Boya Shuho, and also born through the monkeys. So maybe not agree with the chickens at that. No. But basically the idea that you're not supposed to talk about this. And so we thought, well, maybe this is a badge of honor. It means somebody's reading our work, and we hit a wrong there. And maybe someday, in fact, my Chinese colleagues and classmates that have been going to China for 30 years were very upset about this, and we were very dear friends. And like I said, it didn't affect me personally very much, but it did, it's been really tough because it's a great time to go to China, invest a lot learning Mandarin, and I have dear friends there. And actually, the toughest thing was the visa that I was denied in 2006. I was trying to go, it was in Hong Kong, it was denied. I was trying to go to my father's funeral. I was adopted by a Chinese Muslim family, and I couldn't go. It's still hard for me, because I missed the guy. I needed to see him, I knew he was sick. So, it has affected me personally. I can't do research in China. I can't do that project with the Kazakhs and ride up in the mountains and sleep in yurts like I like to do, But I have managed to go back a few times. I get to go to Beijing occasionally. We have to go through a long application process, and you have to have letters of invitation. And I have to say, my Chinese friends, my colleagues, they have stood by me, and they have tried and tried. They've written letters. They've invited me. They've sponsored me. They cite my work now more than they probably did before. And, in the end, I hope it's going to be good. It's certainly not going to be good for some of those junior scholars whose whole careers were somewhat good. And also, all the students who might have wanted to work with me and study with me and now may be a little bit afraid, radioactive, right? And Dru Gladney, he's got blacklisted. I want to work in China. Don't work with China. Don't study Xinjiang. Don't study Tibet. And actually, as I'm going to talk about later, that's not true. We found out that's not true. It had very much to do with that moment of the post 9/11 fallout. And we were sort of caught up in that. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. China is very worried about events in the region. They're worried about the so-called Jasmine Revolution, the Arab Springs that have gone across the Middle East. They're very nervous about this region. One could argue even more nervous than Tibet. Kashgar is a long ways from Beijing, long ways from the Middle East. But the Chinese police presence was greatly increased when all these uprisings took place in Egypt, in Iraq, in Algeria, Tunisia. China strengthened its security and it got very worried. And then some of you may know that just last week, 2 weeks ago now, October 28th, a Jeep exploded in downtown Beijing, right under Chairman Mao's statue, a picture. And you can click on this video and you can watch it. You can get this online. And basically, the Chinese thought that this labeled this as a terrorist attack. And everybody around China was worried. Because prior to this, most of the problems had been in far west China, a long ways away. This was suddenly in the heartland, under the picture of Chairman Mao. And they blamed these terrorists. They blamed these Uyghurs. In fact, indeed, there was a guy in a Jeep who had driven, he was a Uyghur from Xinjiang, and went into the gate. The Jeep exploded, killed 2 tourists, and his wife and his mother, which was horrible. Now, people asked us about it, we said, that's horrible, and it's terrible, and it should be condemned. The guy was probably psychotic. But don't go rounding up all the Uyghurs. for one crazy psychotic individual. Just like in LAX, we didn't start rounding up all the Italians because that guy who shot the TSA employees last time was Italian. Believe Giaci. Anyways, but nevertheless, they're that nervous about this issue. And that shows you how important it is that they begin to round up all these people. Now, one of the reasons they're nervous, and they have a right to be, was on July 5th in 2009, there was a huge riot in western Xinjiang in China, in the Urumqi, the heartland, the capital of Urumqi, in which the largest number of civilians died, mostly Han Chinese during this riot. It was a kind of Rodney King-style ethnic race riot. And a lot of Chinese saw how angry the locals were about the Chinese in Urumqi. Probably more people died in that riot than any other incident in large guns, except for Tiananmen. I don't know how you categorize that, 1989 student uprising. But this was clearly the largest civil unrest. Nearly 300 people died, most of them on Chinese. And it was regularly carried on Chinese video. What's interesting about this video, we had time to go to it, but I'm going to do it. It's carried on the Uyghur Human Rights Project, based in DC, but it's a Chinese newsreel that they're putting on. And they're asking you to watch it to see how viciously the Chinese cracked down on these riots. Now, the Chinese media showed a lot of how vicious the Uyghurs were towards the Han, killing people with knives, dragging bodies across the street, burning buildings, burning cars, etc. And this incident prompted scholars to say, hey, you've had since 2009 to try to figure out what's wrong. Clearly, everybody recognizes something's wrong in the region. The locals are angry. Think about Rodney King incident did. And I lived in LA. I taught at USC and had a house in South Central LA. And we were the only white family on the block. And we loved it. I love my neighbors. And it was a big black church on the corner. We used to go there. African American church. We go there all the time. And Latino families. And that riot just shook us to the core, and also shook LA. And things changed. Police patterns changed. Everything really reassessed it. Heads rolled, and things like that. Well, China has had this ongoing problem, and it goes. And I say it's really it goes way back to when I first started researching this problem. I keep getting asked to talk about it because I've been talking about it for 20 years, and it's almost intractable. And they can't seem to get it right. And Chinese have done so many amazing things. Think how far they've come in 30 years, 40 years. And you'd think they'd be able to solve this problem, but they haven't been able to solve it. And so one scholar, I was just with Scott Radnitz up at Seattle University, Washington, a former student of mine, Sean Roberts, now in DC, said, they basically have two tools in their toolkit to fix this. It's the carrot or the stick. But the carrot's not working either. The carrot is sort of encouraging people to cooperate with the government. You'll get rewards, you get higher salaries, you get jobs with government, or not. And so they suggest that China's development efforts in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous region utilizes an outdated top-down model. In other words, they're relying on an older model of development that's just not working. So what to do? How to look at it? Well, a lot of people say, it's those Uyghurs. Chinese will say, their quality is not good. They're not strong. And they're, terrorists and all these Dongtu, Eastern Turkestanis. They're, they just don't get it. They're barbaric. And look at the way they kill people on the television. And so they have a lot of evidence for that. And I think it's true that there are a lot of issues, ethnic issues, cultural differences, etc., that make this a big problem for China. But to me, this is really the issue right here. This is explains it well. In 1993, China became an oil nation. That affects us. That affects that region. I'm going to tell you why in a minute. And we published an article in 1997 with Jim Doran, who later went to work for CIA, really the State Department, as an analyst, and was in the West Wing of the White House for President Bush on energy policy, and directed that. And a lot of people are saying what we're experiencing now is a cool war, not a cold war, a cool war between the United States and China over oil and over energy and over access to those resources in the Middle East. Well, if you remember the Olympics, you might have remembered a kind of unfolding scroll. And if you remember the Olympics, China's Olympics was just amazing. If you watched it, I was glued to my TV screen. I was cheering for the Chinese because they did so much. Cleaned up the air. There were no terrorist incidents. We were all afraid there might be. People had a great time. The city was a party. And I didn't get to go because I couldn't get a visa. But a lot of my friends went, and they were so successful. The Chinese team did great. And you know, it was a great moment for China. And it was a great moment for the world to see China unfolding and its tremendous history and how they, you know, accomplished it. But you know what happened is a lot of people said, yeah, but it's a dragon awakening. A lot of people in the West were threatened by China's success. And they're afraid they're going to be grabbing our resources, and they're unstoppable. Look, their history is this. The Chinese are sort of coming of age. You know, we're coming back to the great imperial era, the Tang Dynasty, the Han Dynasty, China was great. And a lot of Chinese learned that. But you know, a lot of it has to do with its whole policy of development, that this region is becoming important, and that whole energy resources is not about a dragon reawakening. It's about China trying to modernize, trying to feed its population, 1.4 billion, trying to continue to stock our shelves at Walmart so that we can have a good life. Now we know that Deng Xiaoping, who really is credited with bringing China into the modern era, opening China to the West and trade, first developed the Southeast Coast, these special economic zones, and then he began under the next premier, Jiang Zemin, basically began to work in. But look at this Great West. Look at how much that was ignored. This is where Chongqing gets developed as China's huge, successful city. I was there this summer. I was given a visa. I can tell you why I was there at the end of the story, the talk if you want. It's about my father, who used to fly from India, still part of India, into Chongqing and Chengdu and Kunming to fight the Japanese during World War II. He wasn't a flying tiger. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a hump pilot. And this is my newest project. It's a project the Chinese like a lot more. The Xinjiang project. But basically, we began to see that China realizes to be able to sustain its development, they had to develop West. Now, when we say China's Western Development Project, we tend to think the West is over here. But not for the Chinese. It's really 60% of the country that they're trying to develop and trying to catch up. How to do that? Why to do that? Well, look at the connections. It's China's closest connection to Europe, rail connections. And the Chongqing Rail, high-speed rail network is just extraordinary. And it's really a modern Silk Road. We know about these ancient Silk Roads. And so basically under Hu Jintao, we launched this great West Development Program that goes right through this western region of Urumqi. And this was an area that was pretty much underdeveloped for China's previous 60 years. Why? Well, first of all, it's very sparsely populated. The vast majority of Han Chinese are concentrated here. If you look at a sat map, you can see the density of population is sparse. It's still very sparsely populated compared to the rest of China. But that's starting to change rather dramatically, and that's part of the reason. Now, why? Why was that area so sparsely populated? I mean, look, we're a desert too, right? But we've developed this area in the West. It's been very important for U.S. development. A lot of Chinese say they need to follow our pattern of development. So if we look at China's last great empire under the Manchu, when this area was brought in, this is a very important line. I don't know if you can read that in the back, but this is basically the 15-inch rainfall line. And basically, inside this line, you can plant rice in the south. And the Chinese civilization, if anything, was a successful farming population, agricultural empires is what they were, based on building the rice basket, the bread basket of central China, and feeding this huge population. That's why they could grow, because they could feed them. Now, when they couldn't, that's when they had a huge social unrest. And that's one thing the leaders in Beijing know. They've got to be able to feed the population, but they also have to sustain the development. So basically, it's a basic ecological difference. And actually, China's greatest anthropologist, Fei Xiaotong, said the only difference between the Han Chinese and all the minorities is that the Han are farmers. agriculturists. The minorities are all, nomadic steppe, that kind of thing, herders, pastoralist economies. It's not true, of course, for the Koreans or for the Thai and others, but we won't get into that. So basically what we see is that this aridity kept the Chinese in. And also, the Manchu, the last dynasty of China, tried to basically keep a lot of that population confined to this area. Now we know that the Silk Roads always moved through this area, and the modern Silk Roads have to as well because, again, of ecological and geographic necessity. There aren't that many options when you have deserts, high mountains, the Himalaya range, etc. But today the Silk Road is known for something else. Check the Wikipedia, if you go on Google, you type in Silk Road, you go to Wikipedia. This is the first thing that comes up. The anonymous underground illicit website that this guy was finally busted for. And it's right there on Wikipedia for selling drugs. Now, what's important to know about that Silk Road is it ran through this western region of China, and it was also known historically for smuggling, just like the digital Silk Road. The guys, illicit drugs, prostitution, kind of a Russian mafioso type crime scene. They trimmed it, but these things of bitcoins are very attractive to people because they're hard to tax and they're hard to identify who's spending. Governments don't like it. They like to be able to keep track of these things. Even the NSA, I think, might have a hard time with it. But if we look at the history of China, we know that this western region was undeveloped for many reasons. One was agricultural, ecological. The other was political. Chinese were really not interested in cultural, really not interested in developing this region, and also economic. Didn't need to. Could produce enough food and resources in the North China Plain, in the Huaibei Plain. When I was president of the Pacific Basin Institute, we developed this moving map. The problem with stationary maps is that we tend to think these boundaries were always the same, back millennia, back 1,000 years. As you can see from this map, the map of China today is a fairly recent map for the thousands of years of Chinese civilization. Fairly recent. And that for the most part, under the Chinese dynasties, they stayed pretty much in this North China Plain. And then this little corridor, known as the Heshi corridor, where the Silk Roads came through. And this is where Muslims came into China. This is where jade, the Jade Gate, came into China. Most of it was produced in the West. Also, of course, silk and other precious commodities. Again, precious commodities, oil, energy, byproducts, rare earth metals have to travel this route. It's kind of heavy stuff. It's hard to FedEx it, right? So you got to have trains, you got to have networks, etc. Now, interestingly enough, we get to the Ming. A minute ago, you saw the Yuan. Now we get to the Qing. Here's basically the contemporary era of China. Now, who were the Qing? They were Manchu. Who was the Yuan? They were Mongols. Steppe-based empires in the north who basically extended the border of China into the west, like we have today. So basically, you can go online and get that map from our website. What's happening is that China has precious resources below the ground. This is its last source of petrochemical resources, as well as above the ground, trade routes. That makes this region of Xinjiang very critical to China. And I would dare say, strategically, even more important than Tibet. Because Tibet isn't an area that you can pass precious goods through. It does have a lot of mineral resources. But strategically, this region is very critical to Tibet. And basically, look at this. U.S. Energy Agency, 2013, China, the second largest importer of oil. Now that's where 9/11 comes in. Suddenly, China has to have improved relationships with who? The Middle East, the same place that we get our oil. Suddenly, there might be some issues. And indeed, Jim Dorian has continued to work on these issues. He argues that most of the statistics that we've seen on this issue is actually far below what people project. In other words, that China's actual energy needs are going to go way up here. And there's their GDP, but their energy needs, so their target energy needs, is actually going to far surpass what even the Department of Energy predicts. So he paints a very, very scary scenario. of China's need for outside external resources. And of course, that mirrors the issue of emissions and China's problem with carbon emissions. And also, there's vehicle ownership, which has even surpassed the IMF targets. Now, some of you may have been watching the news lately with the apocalypse. It's a new word I just learned. There's Beijing, Tiananmen Square. This is a NASA map, satellite map. Even the pandas are suffering. So we know that China is paying a huge price for this style of development. And we know the challenges are huge for China. But Chinese leaders feel they need to go through this period of development, just like we did. If you grew up in LA like I did, I'm a local boy, born and raised in Pomona, there was not nearly as clean as it is. I didn't even hardly know these mountains existed. And you laugh, but you hardly could ever see them growing up. And China feels like it has to go through similar patterns of development as we do to be able to address their energy needs. Now, basically, the other issue for China is it has fairly good coal resources, but we know that coal is very polluting, and this is their challenge, and the consumption has actually gone up. China's also linked to the Middle East like never before, so that when you have a hiccup in the Middle East, Chinese catch a cold or catch a cough, literally, and this is a big problem. So, what's going on with China? And this is part of a new research project of mine. It's actually taking in Saudi Arabia for the first time. I'm really excited about that. I don't think so. I'll get any women taxi drivers, but we'll see by the time I get there. China's been involved in the Middle East for some time, but only has it recently stepped up its development. And the question is China pivoting to the Middle East? Well, whoever wrote this article doesn't realize that China pivoted to the Middle East a long time ago. And like I said, are playing this game a lot better than us. Indeed, the United States government is quite concerned about this issue. There were hearings this summer, and if you're interested in this issue, all of these papers were online. And believe it or not, NEH Lecture was there testifying. He's one of our Xinjiang 13 members. And one thing that I noticed is one of the testimonies by John Alterman says that Chinese strategic thinking remains focused on the possibility of a confrontation with the United States over that Middle Eastern war. So this is where we get involved. Are we going to go to war with China over the Middle East? Oil reserves? A lot of high-level policy now expectation. Now we do know that China has been very actively pursuing relations with the Middle East over the last 2 years. The number of delegations has gone up, the number of trade missions, the premiers visiting, and then there's and the trade members. Interestingly enough, back in the 90s, China's largest trading partner was Pomona, which is a small Gulf state. Now, we'll see in a minute, it's more Saudi Arabia and Iran. But it shows that in the 90s, China began these trade efforts with mostly the Gulf states. Interestingly enough, in 1992, China established diplomatic relations with Israel. And by 2009, it was a $4.6 billion. Once again, Israel and the Middle East, they're all Chinese friends. They're all doing business with China, right? What's going on? Well, look at this. Iran, Saudi Arabia, even Algeria has huge investments by China. So that shows you that what China is doing, it's cultivating greater and greater connections and trade relations with the Middle East. Now, this is basically the new Silk Road. So when I studied the Silk Roads, when I was in grad school, they were ancient. Roman Empire time, Han Dynasty, etc. Now we have a new Silk Road, and it's basically connecting China to the Middle East just like before. Yitzhak Shakur, Israeli scholar, also an honorary member of the Xinjiang 13. He can't go back to China because he participated in our book. But he's been writing on this subject for many, many years, and pointed out that in the 50s and 80s, China's game was legitimacy. It wanted to legitimate recognition by the Middle East. And I began to map out sort of what was going on. In the 40s and 50s, mostly socialist-oriented governments like the Ba'ath Party of Iraq and Syria were the first to recognize because the Chinese were communists. Right? But in the 90s and the 80s, Beijing, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and then later the Central Asian states. So what we begin to see is that China begins to move away from ideological constraints. What was China going through? Communist revolution, establishing a new communist country, and then the Cultural Revolution. So ideology was very important for China, not so much pragmatism. And in the 90s, what happens? Deng Xiaoping, China's development, they immediately lose from it. So let's forget about the fact that these guys are Muslims, they're not socialists. Let's start doing trade with them. And China begins to do that. Now, I point out that China has a rather Teflon relationship with the Middle East. Unlike the United States, where we've had all of these uprisings and problems and anti-Americanisms, particularly during the Arab Spring, we thought, oh, democratization is flowering in the Middle East. They're all going to come running to American-style democracy. Kill our ambassador, protest our embassies, and suddenly we realized, the U.S. relationship with the Middle East is very, very delicate. And now, of course, we don't have time in a little section on Syria, but I know we want to talk, so we're going to talk about Syria. China has a very good relationship with Syria. Now, some people can credit or blame President Obama for creating this environment of a democratized, highly chaotic Middle East that has a lot of anti-American sentiment. Because he was there in the Middle East, as well as Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, pushing a democratic agenda, pushing a human rights agenda. They didn't like that. They didn't like the U.S. telling them what to do. They didn't like the U.S. scolding them for not being democratic enough. And it was reflected. And we can talk about why. It's a long history of colonialism in the Middle East. But by contrast, look what China was doing. China was busily making friends, busily investing, and building a really strong cooperative relationship. Look what China did in Central Asia. It started the Shanghai Cooperation Organization after the fall of the former Soviet Union and built friends of all the countries that border China. Now, most countries have real tumultuous border relations with new states, very unstable states on the borders. Not China. They somehow managed to build friendships, to have cooperation organizations. Even the Arab Spring is not going to destabilize the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China's built other relationships in North Africa. Over 50 countries are members of this relationship, as well as all the Middle Eastern states have almost all de-recognized Taiwan and have recognized China over the last 20 years. Tremendous, tremendous diplomatic success. What are they doing right? I think we need to learn from them. They're not pushing ideology. They're basically building trade relations. On the other hand, they're ignoring human rights abuses and other issues that we can talk about later. Now, I'll just say 3 quick things about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Some of you may have heard of it. Some people in D.C. say, oh, it's the next, they're trying to build a NATO. They won't let the United States join. We try to become members. They won't let us in. It's a private club. They're going to take over ASEAN, the China threat group. And really, I'll just say 3 things. It's not in Shanghai. It's not cooperative. And it's not very well organized. It's based in Beijing. It's mostly a bilateral organization. It's not doing multilateral trade like it's set up to do. It's mostly military now, focused in Central Asia and anti-terrorism. And still, most of it, it's not organized well in a sense that many of the member states, voting rights, they don't really know where they stand. Iran's a good example. They're very unhappy with their participation in this. Another problem area for China, besides the relationship with Iran, which we don't have time to talk about, is Turkey. Now, one of the reasons Turkish relations with China, which are greatly improved, but are having problems, is the guys that we started this talk about, the Uyghurs. Now, this is a conference in Istanbul. You can see how it's portrayed. And it's an Eastern Turkestan, Free Eastern Turkestan Symposium. I rarely turn down a free ticket invitation to speak. You can tell I don't mind speaking. I enjoy it. I enjoy sharing my knowledge. And I enjoy, hard questions. So I'm going to try to go fast and leave time for some good questions for you. But basically, I gave a talk in which I talked about the role of the Uyghurs in this very delicate relationship between Turkey and China. Shortly after this conference, Wen Jiabao, the Chinese foreign minister, visited Turkey And suddenly, Turkey began preventing these kinds of conferences and has begun to ratchet down this kind of organization rhetoric. Now, who are the Uyghurs? What is the Uyghur problem? And what I'm going to argue is that it's not really a Xinjiang problem. It's a Uyghur problem. Why is it Uyghur? Right? Now, if you look at these Uyghurs are Turkic people. They don't look Chinese, most of them. They don't speak a Chinese language. And they have a memory of this region as belonging to a Uyghur kingdom that was part of the Turkic Khanate that goes back to the 6th to the 9th century. And this is the region of the Eastern Turkish Khanate that includes Kashgar today. That was at a British London museum. That's their map, not mine. What's really going on? What's really going on? In my opinion is we can talk a lot about human rights, we can talk about Chinese policy. But in my opinion, it's very easy to see. There's a lot of disagreement on these issues, right? China treats these people, religious policy, education policy, bilingual education policy, a lot of issues. But Chinese scholars and Russian scholars and Uyghur scholars, everybody disagrees on all these issues. Nobody disagrees with this. 1940, only 5% of the population of the region was Han Chinese. Thanks to a Han Chinese warlord, Sheng Shicai, who was good at taking down numbers because he wanted to know who the people he had to oppress were and control, where his threats were, we got a very good demographic profile of this region in 1950. By 2000s, look what's going on. Now, we can debate, was it 38% Han, was it 40%, 37%? What's the Uyghur population? Are they still the majority group in the region? We can debate those numbers, but nobody debates the overall trend. Mass migration. And I don't care what kind of sociologist you are, what kind of demographer you are, everybody knows when you have this level of mass migration, you're going to have social problems. You're going to have different things. And this has been a big issue for China. Why? Why are they allowing such mass migration? Why are they encouraging it? Some people say sponsoring. This is why. They want China to integrate this region like never before and turn it into Los Angeles or Houston. And when you look at this region, an enormous development. In the early 1980s, I was doing research on this mosque in 1983. I wish I had a good picture, but I didn't have any aerial pictures. This is from a hotel window that I took much later. And this was the tallest building in the area. And it's actually a Chinese Muslim mosque. It's not even a Uyghur mosque. You can see the Chinese-style roof. The pace of development has been so amazing. The freeways, like LA freeways, etc. And so when we see riots, it even looked like LA-style riots, Rodney King-style riots. And what's shocking about these riots that took place in 2009, and these videos you can watch if we have time, they're really gross and gruesome, but basically it took Chinese by surprise. They couldn't believe not only how developed this region was, but how tense everything was on the street. And the racial and ethnic tension and religious tensions spilled over on the street. And what was also amazing about this was that, is that it took place in Urumqi, and the Uyghurs in Urumqi population is very, very low, about 5 to 10%. Many of the problems in the region with Uyghurs have been in the south. But this took place, and what was it over? It was over mistreatment of Uyghur workers in far Guangdong next to Hong Kong. So why were they rioting in Urumqi? Because Uyghurs felt that the Uyghur workers were mistreated in a toy factory. So it spilled over into this region that was all and enormous. Now, what's going on? Why did I get a visa? Chinese said that this riot was inspired by terrorism, inspired by radical Islam, inspired by jihad. The guy that drove the Jeep in Tiananmen Square, exploded it, is an Islamic fundamentalist, jihadi terrorist. And they point to this organization known as ETA, this Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement. And the United States agreed with China and said, you're right, there is this international terrorist organization. And by the way, we're going to invade Afghanistan. Would you mind, on your border, we send armies in there? Well, China would have minded, I think. But there was a trade-off. Through cooperation with the United States on cracking down on this international terrorist organization, notice that us Xinjiang guys, the specialists, we'd never heard of this organization. And we focused on this issue. We'd studied terrorist groups, and we'd studied dissent groups and human rights issues and all that. We'd never heard of it. And by 2008, the Department of State agreed with this. But by then, the cat was out of the bag. This group, Etten, and Etten was blamed for the Jeep explosion in downtown Beijing. A group that many of the scholars think actually, if it did exist, it didn't exist very long because they killed the leader of it in Pakistan a year after we discovered it was around, 2002, right? So this guy, he thinks it exists. And there have been scholars all over the world writing books and saying, oh yeah, China has a terrorism problem. You know what happens when you write a book about this? You get big grants. You get invited to speak, large speakers' fees. China has terrorists. And often Chinese will pay you to come to their country as an international scholar to say China has a terrorism problem. We scholars are saying, wait a minute, there's something more going on. It's more complicated. Yeah, there are some crazy people out there. Some of them may be inspired by religion. But is there a network of separatist terrorists connected to international organizations that is a threat to China? A lot of us were sort of raising questions about this. Some of us even testified to Congress about this. And that led to Congress reversing its position, contributed to a reevaluation of why this organization is organized. Now, if they had never recognized this group as a possible terrorist threat, and we discovered that all the intelligence the U.S. used to classify these guys, then they would never have gone, rounded up Uyghurs to go to Guantanamo Bay. Because it gave the U.S. legal rights that these guys were suspected terrorists. And at one point, there were 22 Uyghurs in Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay, because they were suspected of being members of Etten, which was legally mandated by the United States Congress as an international terrorist organization, and the United Nations, and China. So legally, we could pay headhunters, which we did in Pakistan, $5,000 to $10,000 each to grab one of these suspected terrorists using severe detention methods and ship them to Cuba and keep them for 10 to 20 years because they were. So the issue is, most of them have been released. In 2008, they were recognized as non-combatants. And many of them admitted being trained by Taliban, but not terrorists against the United States. And that's what we don't arrest every terrorist. So it's to say that probably some of them are terrorists, probably some of them are motivated by Islam, but whether they were part of a large international organization that was a threat to the United States and international interests and China is questionable. And that's a matter of scholarship and a matter of debate. But what we do know is these guys got sent to Cuba. Some of them have been released to Palau, to El Salvador, even to Italy. And basically, if you're a Uyghur, it's certainly better than Cuba, but it's not a place that you really want to go because there's no good lamb there. And there's no mosques and things like that. Some of them are making those efforts. Now, what's going on? Even Oxford Analytica is basically saying these were useful terrorists to China's policies for development in the region. Just like terrorism has been useful to U.S. military budgets, to U.S. meddling overseas, to U.S. Middle Eastern policy of expanding our military operations in the Middle East, so for China, we're having this terrorist threat very useful for its development in the region, and very useful for including it. So basically, most of us who have been following this issue argue that, hey, terrorism is wrong anywhere, violence is wrong anywhere, it's no justification. But on the other hand, it's not an organized threat to China. And basically, China is a very strong country. And what's happening, interestingly enough, right before 9/11, the chairperson, the party secretary of Xinjiang said, come to Xinjiang, there's no terrorism. They themselves said we don't have a terrorist problem. But after 9/11, suddenly, aha, China has a terrorism problem too. So this is kind of what we think is going on. The Uyghurs themselves, of course, international Uyghur organizations, claim to be peaceful, claim to be like Tibet, the Dalai Lama, to not support terrorism. Of course, most organizations are going to claim that. Real terrorists aren't going to stand up and say, hey, by the way, we're terrorists, unless it's on the internet and we can't figure out who they are, etc. They don't put their address on there. Now, what's going on? Where do these people come from? Basically, what we're looking at, uh-oh, how do I divide that? You did that. I don't know what's going on. Basically, this is this region of Western China that the Uyghurs came from. And at the same time as we had a Tibetan Empire and a great Tang Dynasty Empire, we had Uyghurs. And basically, the Uyghurs had an empire. They were defeated. They moved into this area, what is now Western China. And they were Buddhist. They weren't Muslims until very late. They converted to Islam rather late. And you can see where they converted to Islam starting in the 9th, 10th century. And Islam spread very slowly into this region. So the Uyghurs were like one of the last Central Asian populations. Islam came to Central Asia, to the Stans, the Turkic peoples, very early. By the 7th and 8th century, most of them converted. The Uyghurs resisted. Some people think because Buddhism was so strong in this region. In fact, most of the Silk Road religions came via the Uyghurs into China. Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, Buddhism. The Uyghurs have always been a very eclectic people. Now, if you look at this chart, and you can, actually, now I do want to there we go, yeah. These are Uyghur Sufis. You know about Sufism? It's a mystical tradition in Islam. Sort of like Pentecostalism in Christianity. A lot of chanting, a lot of swaying, a lot of dancing. And if you listen carefully, you'll hear a drum. And that's the shaman's drum, the shaman. Notice that shamanism goes way back in Uyghur, Central Asian Islam, pretty Islam. But eventually other religions came in, Manichaeism, Buddhism, Christianism, and then eventually they all convert to Islam. But despite being devout Muslims, Sunnis all, nevertheless, this kind of Sufi tradition is probably influenced by shamanism, pervades Islam. And one thing we found about Sufism is that very few devout Sufis become radical Islamists. Most of them do not support violence, peace-loving. Rumi is famous for his love poetry, almost erotic poetry, his love for Allah, and they abhor and commit violence. So many of these cultures that are pervaded by Sufism are rarely susceptible to radical Wahhabi-style restrictive Islam. First of all, the Taliban hate Islam. The Al-Qaeda hate Islam. And they've probably arrested and killed many more Muslims that they believe worship incorrectly, maybe Sufis, than Westerns altogether. They hate this kind of style of music, and they feel that it is not proper Islam. It's not more than others Islam to practice it this way. They're shouting and singing the names of Allah, and they call them Huda because of a Persian influence on the region. They're not Shiites, they're Sunnis. If you've ever heard of the whirling dervishes in Turkey, that's essentially what they do. And through ecstatic dancing and chanting, they connect to God. One of the reasons scholars say is because one of the reasons is they do not know Arabic. They can't read the Quran. So this is an immediate way to connect to God, like Western America, Catholic, Christian, Pentecostals, without going through the text. It's hard to read, but I've tried. And so for these people who converted to Islam rather late, it gives them immediate access, chanting the names of Allah, bringing them closer to God. So I think there's a certain validity to the idea that Uyghurs, for the most part, are not going to be moved into radical Islam unless strong motivation. My final argument is that some of Chinese policy may be pushing young Uyghur men into the arms of radical Islam because they have very low influence. One thing we do know going on in China are these mass incidents of social unrest throughout China. And so what I will argue is that what we saw in Urumqi, that enormous riot, was similar to what we see going on in the rest of China. And notice most of them are in the heartlands of China where the Chinese are concentrated. And look at the numbers. Now, these are official government statistics. China generally doesn't like to air its dirty laundry or its dirty air. It likes to put on a good face, as every nation likes to. So show your best side. Chinese are very proud of their accomplishments, and they have every right to be. But interestingly enough, the government has admitted that in 2005, and in 2010, it's over 100,000, these incidents of social unrest. So many of these are labor unrest. Many of these are disgruntled peasants who've been evicted from their homes without recourse. Many of them are migrant laborers who get mistreated, who can't get into schools, who feel like nobody cares for them, who don't have retirement, pension plans, right? So this mass development of China has dislocated millions, 20 million, some people say 100 million, and nobody really knows because a lot of these are undocumented. And everybody argues that this is a real problem in China, this social unrest. One mistake here is that it's not so much in the periphery. It's not the Uyghurs, it's not the Tibetans. We've had Tibetan riots, we've had Uyghur riots, but look, it's in the heartland. It's all over China. So what we're seeing is that the Uyghurs are Muslims, certainly, but they're upset about a lot of things that are not related to Islam. They're upset about that mass migration, about the lack of jobs, about all kinds of things. And really, I think, since we're in a university, and we're not just journalists and talking about what's going on out there, we're trying to analyze it. One of my most useful references, and scholars that I turn to a great deal lately, is James T. Scott, a historian, political science, and anthropologist at Yale. And basically, he's argued that it's the nation state, as it has expanded to these mountainous areas. He works in Southeast Asia, areas he calls Zomia, which includes these sort of ungovernable mountain areas where opium is grown and swinton agriculture is produced, slash and burn. It says that certain groups practice the art of not being governed. You get your bitcoins. You don't want to be taxed. You want to maintain that nomadic, what I call nomadology lifestyle. Stay under the radar. Preserve your independence. And so for Uyghurs and Tibetans and other people that were in these areas, they're not used to a central government telling them where to go to school, where to live. They want to have their own way. They're Californians, man. You know, they want to get in their car and cruise. They're Westerners. So this is a big problem. There's another issue that Jim Scott, in his most recent book, talks about. He calls it internal colonialism. Now, I made the mistake of publishing an article where I use this phrase a very long time ago about the Uyghur. Chinese didn't like this. I guarantee you. You go to China, you talk to Chinese scholars, Gladney calls this NEH German 独来者受这样我们没有不是殖民地国家 So we're not a colonialist government. Chinese have never been colonial. Well, if they read my article carefully, they'll say this is a Western model about a practice by the British that I think is useful for understanding why Uyghurs are upset. Because they feel colonized. They feel like their autonomous region is really more like a penal colony than an area where they have a lot of authority and that's the subject of a lot of problems. It's this kind of minoritization that they feel. If you talk to Uyghurs, they'll tell you off the record that they feel like they've been colonized. And also, even the word Xinjiang is kind of a colonial term. I often tell my Chinese friends, hey, if you want to say Xinjiang was always part of China, don't call it Xinjiang. That's a new region. Right? Now, Obama has basically urged China to engage with the Dalai Lama, as well as Hillary Clinton. Interestingly enough, and this speaks to the importance of Xinjiang, Obama has never met with the Uyghur leader, who hangs out with the Dalai Lama. This is Václav Havel, of course. This is Rabia Qadir. You may never have heard of her. But Václav Havel, certainly a world-recognized leader, arguing that anyone's human rights, the abuse of human rights is abuse of all human rights, is his famous phrase. And here she is, right next to the Dalai Lama. I call her the Uyghur Dalai Mama, because she's the elected leader of the World Uyghur Congress. She was in prison. Several of us criticized Chinese government for that. She was let out early. And the place of those riots were right in front, and this is her building in downtown Urumqi. Why does she have a building named after her still in downtown Urumqi? In 1995, she was one of, if not the most wealthiest woman in all of China. Amazing that a woman could do this in China. And she was a representative sent by the Chinese government to the Beijing Women's World Congress, businesswoman. But what happened? She got arrested. A lot of her assets were confiscated for 8 years in house arrest. 2 of her children, she had 8 children, 2 of her children are still under house arrest. But she was let out eventually, and the Chinese are angry at her because she promised she wouldn't get involved in the Uyghur causes when she got out of China. Of course, she got very involved. She's honored by a lot of the Uyghurs around the world, especially the Turkic population. And I find it amazing that a woman can lead this international Uyghur association where they're all Muslims. Many of them are very, very devout Muslims, and yet they respect her like their own Dalai Lama. It's extraordinary. And she's an extraordinary person. A lot of Chinese don't like her because they think of her as being radical and she wants to divide China. But her official policy is peace. Her official policy is non-independence, just like the Dalai Lama. And she takes her cue from them. Now, maybe behind the scenes, if she got what she wants, she would eventually want to have an independent country. But good luck with that. I think she's realistic. She's a realistic businesswoman. And I'll tell you a secret. A lot of Uyghur men don't like her either. Because she's too much of a businessman. She's too businessman. She's too strong. And we were waiting for her in Estonia one night at 12 a.m. And the Uyghur men were really upset because they had to stay up. She got there at the hotel, and she made them go into a meeting till 3 a.m. and then get up at 9 a.m. and have another meeting. They were like, oh my gosh, she really works us too hard. And they're not used to having a woman authority. But interestingly enough, she's been nominated 4 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. If you're a terrorist and you're advocating violence, you don't get nominated by the Nobel. And she won the Rackfield Prize. Many of the former Norwegian Peace Prize winners for the Nobel Prize also won the Rackfield Prize. So there is a strong indication that she is not just an occasional candidate, and she's been nominated 4 times. There she's kissing my daughter. Now, of course, Uyghur women are not engaged as much in the public sphere, and so it's very unusual for her. These are Uyghur women in Kashgar. And interestingly enough, I saw her, the last time I saw her was in Estonia. And guess who's funding this conference in Estonia? International Uyghur Women, the National Endowment for Democracy, your tax dollars, thank you very much. Helped pay my ticket, I'm sure. And also this Uyghur Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization. Here she is with Uyghur women from all over the world, outside of China, of course. And they're learning about Uyghurs' participation in promoting human rights, how to use social media, how to use Facebook to connect. And of course, unfortunately, how to flag upside down. Because they're a transnational diaspora. And this is why China's problem, Xinjiang problem, is also a global problem. Because these people are all over the globe, and they're using social media to connect like never before. Right? And this is a very effective way for them to maintain their Uyghur identity that many of them feel is under threat about Chinese policies in the region. Only about 9.2 million, maybe a little more in China today, but maybe about 1 million outside of China. Nobody really knows. Maybe that's a bit high estimate, but large populations. Now, I'll just point out one quick thing, and I think I've probably gone way over, is that their centers of real influence are DC and Munich. And it has a lot to do with the U.S. government funding for radio liberty and radio free Asia. So there's a kind of chain migration. The U.S. government is involved in supporting the Uyghurs. But we're also involved in diplomacy with China. This organization is very important. It looks sort of like the United Nations, kind of a mirror, but it's the unrepresented nations, including, I think, with the flag for Hawaiian sovereignty groups. And I was involved with them when I was living in Hawaii. And certainly the Tibetans, right? And they're accused in almost every nation where they live of being separatists. So it's not just the Uyghurs, and not just the Tibetans, it's also Hawaiians who want to have some Hawaiians want to have their own independent nation. And people from Vermont, too, I understand. But China is very threatened by this issue of separatism. They've passed laws. Why is China so worried? Well, I've given you the Xinjiang reason, because of the resources and the importance of that region. Tibet is also very important. China is still historically part of China. But I think the real issue, one of the real big issues behind all this, is Taiwan. And Chinese diplomats have told me, Tibet is a big headache. We don't really need Tibet. But if we were to let Tibet go, then Xinjiang would go, and the jewel in the crown, we would never get Taiwan. Taiwan's coming back to China on its own through business ties. And it's been a peaceful immigration. But Tibet and Xinjiang, and maybe even Inner Mongolia, has not been that story. And this law applies to all of them. Interestingly enough, though China opposes separatism and throughout the world and opposes this group organization, UNPO, nevertheless, it supported a southern Sudan. So it shows you that China's engagement with the Middle East is actually forcing it to be so pragmatic that it goes against its long-standing position of non-intervention. And as I've suggested elsewhere, basically, China has this long tradition of non-intervention. Stay out of the way. Be a leader of the third world. Help the third world people develop like China develops. Don't interfere. And I think that's why they've gotten along so well in the Middle East. They don't tell other governments what to do. But in the case of southern Sudan, they have a choice. Why? Oil and energy. They're being forced to engage like never before. So that's very, very important to them. Now, let's just talk about this briefly. I'm probably going to really time here, but if the Western press is correct, that China mistreats minorities so badly, why are the numbers going up so much? One thing we've found out is that it's popular, to some extent, to be ethnic stage. And this guy, Ma Rong, professor of sociology and anthropology in Beijing at Peking University, old friend of mine, we were at Harvard together. He got his PhD from Brown University, an American PhD. He's actually a Chinese Muslim, a Chinese Muslim. He's saying, wait a minute, we need to back up. Look at all these minority populations increasing. If we keep along this trend, we might become like the first. And he himself is a minority. And he's saying China needs to take another look at this policy. Now, what is the policy? Well, it's known as China's Minzu policy. It inherited from the Chinese nationalists, Sun Yat-sen, Liang Qichao, and others, promoted the idea that the Chinese, Sun Yat-sen, had never had the idea of being a nation. So they imported this idea of being a Minzu. Han people have been around a long time, Uyghurs have been around a long time, Tibetans, but they were never listed as a Minzu. The Minzu policy is a new policy. And in fact, the Chinese Dabaike encyclopedia says in 1904, the word came into Chinese. Like the Western terms, science, democracy, even religion was an imported term that Chinese social scientists used. Now, look at these numbers. Minorities are still a very small percentage. But Ma Rong says that the policy, and then there's some unidentified peoples. My good colleague has written a ethnography of China. He says a whole section of unidentified peoples. They're still growing. Still more and more people that want to be identified. For example, the Muslims in China have 10 separate nationalities. And their numbers are increasing dramatically. We've been talking a lot about the Uyghur. They're only the second largest group. The largest group is known as the Hui, and there's about 21 million Muslims in China. That's a large number, but divided along separate nationalities. In fact, if we put China on a scale of world Muslim population, that's a pretty sizable number. But one thing we do know about Chinese Muslims is they participate in Asian Islam. They're East Asians, but also we know that the epicenter of Islamic populations in the world are in Asia, not in the Middle East, where we have lower populations. Now, it's important to know that for these peoples, they're part of China's democratic process, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and they're celebrated in the Olympics, part of an old Maoist policy that they've got to unite together to bring China forward, following Chairman Mao in this picture, this classic painting. And if you saw the Olympics, it's going to blow over if you saw the Olympics and you saw Chinese National Day, you see how important these minorities are for the idea of China as a united, multinational, modern nation state. If you saw the Olympics, you may have remembered this opening ceremony, except it's not going to load, that's okay with that time. But here it comes. We'll just see a little bit. But look at the words for this song, the opening song of the Olympics, that China put on stage for the world. It's about prosperity, about moving ahead. And here's this young girl singing this anthem, but who's she surrounded by? Minority children. So they're so important to China's idea of itself as a multicultural modern nation. And I've written about this. Unfortunately, we found out later that she was lip syncing because the real singer, Pompey, was regarded as too ugly, too fat to be on this little stage. So we also found out that these minority children, not a single one of them was minority. They're all wearing costumes. But of course, the Olympics is a staged event, and even in Sydney, they lip synced as well. So they weren't the only ones that have done this. But this is rather important for China's whole presentation right at the beginning. So this diversity is very important. It's what Benedict Anderson said. They stretched the nation state all the way down. This imagined community. Think of multilingual, multicultural Chinese. It could have hundreds of those. And this is what Ma Rong's argument is. Why should we have 56 official nations? Why not open it up? Let's have hundreds, but let's not give them special privileges. Let's not give them autonomous regions. Let's take care of our poverty problem, not our ethnic problem. If we don't, we might break up the former Soviet Union. Now, his ideas obviously have some resonance, because Ma Rong, the scholar at Baghdad, was unknown, according to Baidu, until 2010. If you Baidu'd his name, Googled his name, you didn't get it. But 2010, boom, look at that. Everybody's reading Ma Rong. Yeah, he's selling his books now. And also, this whole issue of ethnic policy prior to 2009 wasn't that big of an issue for Chinese netizens, if you want Baidu. But you could also argue the 2008 Tibetan riots, 2009 Urumqi riots, that also had that thing. But it led to people like Ma Rong saying, wait a minute, we've got to think about these policies. We've got to reestablish it. We've got to change it. We've got to do something. Well, what to do? He says, let's become like America. He did his PhD in America. We should make ethnicity not official, not political, cultural. I'm Irish. You're Italian. You're Polish. Americans do it, and Americans get along great. Well, he didn't live through the LA riots like I lived. And we certainly have a race problem. We have a racialization problem. We have a lot of oppression, we have discrimination. Even Jewish Americans suffer a great deal of prejudice still today. But yet he's saying, well, you know, but China, it's got this Minzu problem, and these people are going to want to have an independent country. So what he's arguing is basically, in English, we have this two different terms, ethnicity, which is generally the kind of we subjective, but we also have the idea of nation or nationality. Think of Native Americans having passports, or in Canada, First Nations. It's more of an official term. He's saying in China, they only have Minzu, and it's only the political. But as I'll argue in print, in response to that, no, there's actually an overlap. And China's Minzu policy has both. And to dismantle it, for a lot of these minorities, it's about the only way they have been able to progress over the last 50 years. So it's a big debate. And the one example I use to conclude this lecture is to suggest that the problem with this dismantling policy is that there's some successful examples. We talked about the Uyghurs, Tibetans, difficulties China's had integrating Uyghurs and Tibetans. But the white people are the opposite. They're very well integrated in China. In fact, I'll give you one example. This guy is one of the most successful private businessmen in China. He's from Xinjiang. He's a Muslim, but he's Hui. And he has this private oil company. And I met him in Malaysia and introduced by a Hui Muslim woman. And basically, he's a very devout Muslim businessman, but has his own private oil company. Who ever heard of such a thing? And he's a billionaire, and he's doing great. And Chinese are including a lot of these people in their policy. His company is going blockbusters, and they're just doing all kinds of stuff. Now, Chinese Muslims are traveling in the Middle East. They're using many of them in the foreign diplomacy. Yet still, I don't think any of the Middle East envoys have been Hui Muslims. The Hui are the Chinese-speaking Muslims. And notice that unlike the Uyghur, who are mostly concentrated in this region, Hui are everywhere. My first year of fieldwork, I spent a year in Ningxia. It was also out of limit. I was not allowed to live there, but I got special permission. Because they wanted Western research to understand how successful China's policy has been with the Hui. Not always been easy. There's ethnic tensions. Why were they there? Where did they come from? There it is, the Silk Roads. And actually the name of the play, means to return in Chinese. So some people, some Han don't like the way, they wish they would return. But basically some people think it may be related to the pronunciation of the Uyghur, but also the idea on pilgrimage. As Muslims, they return frequently to the Middle East. So there's something about that. And I'll conclude with this brief story. If you watch the Olympics, one of the main events in the opening ceremony was celebrating this guy, Zheng He. And I dare say most Americans have never heard of Zheng He. And many Chinese don't even know today that he was a Muslim. And that one of his motivations for going on these voyages, 60 years before Columbus, the largest navy the world had ever seen, much larger. Look at the ships that he was in. This is the size of his ships compared to the Santa Maria, the Nina, and the Pinta, right? Look, huge ships, huge navy, 8 expeditions, 28 ships, huge armada. China could have taken over the whole world. Did they? Didn't plant any flags. They're right. China's not been a colonial nation, not externally, right? Thank God. I think we'd all be speaking Chinese if they decided to stay. Were all the places where they traded. 7 or 8 expeditions, 28 ships. They could have easily taken over. They're the largest, most powerful navy in the world, and one of the most successful economies in the world at this period. What did they do? They brought some exotic animals back. They did some trade. They set up trading posts. Some people think they actually helped export Islam to Southeast Asia. They did some amazing things. And then what did they do after that? They fired the admiral, they buried the books, and they denied it ever happened. So unlike Western imperial powers, unlike Europe, unlike the United States, they didn't establish colonies. They didn't extort resources. They didn't dominate local populations. They were in business, trade, and exploration, and science. So that's an example that I don't believe China is expansionist. I don't believe it's a threat to the West. I don't believe there's going to be a conflict over Middle Eastern oil. If we look at Chinese history, China wants to develop. China is a strong sovereign nation. They want to improve their situation for their people. But if we look at the history, and I'll conclude with this look into Afghanistan, China's never marched into Afghanistan. Alexander the Great died in these mountains trying to take over China. China has many opportunities. They are expanding influence, trade, etc., but they haven't. Energy security is a primary security for China, but it's also meaning that China is going to have an increasingly important role to play in the Middle East, particularly, I hope, in peacemaking and helping to resolve its Arab-Israeli conflict. And I actually wish China would play a more direct role, even though that's not the Chinese style. But one of the phrases that they're using in DC a lot is becoming a more responsible stakeholder. And basically it's saying, hey, the U.S. is breaking our backs to the economy. You've got stakes here too. Why don't you start footing the bill a little bit more, be more responsible for shipping, for maintaining peace in the Pacific, not causing problems, etc. So there's some debates about Mr. Bradley's and those issues. But by and large, I think we need to remember that the rise of China's history has been generally peaceful. We need to study as Westerners and learn from that history. It's a deep and fascinating and important history that's going to affect us. Right? But also, international organizations need to continue to urge China for its own good, for its own domestic stability, to not follow this top-down world development, to not follow the United States example of developing the West. What did we do? We got rid of them. We killed all the natives or put them in reservations. Right? The indigenous people suffered greatly under Western Euro-American expansion. China doesn't need to follow that history. Okay, so I think we'll